I am from the University of Edinburgh, a research fellow there. I have a confession that I'll make to you right now. I'm not a real shark biologist. So you got duped there. I'm actually a deep sea biologist, as you mentioned, primarily. Later on, I'll tell you a little bit how I got into sharks. I think not literally, but for the science anyway. I was sort of drawn in when I was studying the deep ocean. So I'll get to that in maybe 10, 15 minutes to give you that little background. But I do work with a large consortium now of other scientists in universities, in the government, with Scottish Natural Heritage, sea anglers, fishing groups, even the oil and gas guys are all pulling together to pull across information about sharks, skates and rays in Scotland. I'm going to refer, instead of saying elasmobranchs, which is the technical term, I am just going to say sharks, but I do want to include that to mean the lovely big skates we have in Scotland and the rays as well. So when I say sharks, let's think of all these sort of flappy things, but also the swimmy bits as well. Okay, so really the idea behind getting this large group of people together was that we wanted to be able to deliver a research agenda, a new kind of research agenda to help save Scotland's sharks and conserve them and study them. We really know very little about Scotland sharks. And that's sort of, what Nicola might be thinking, well, why on earth would you want to do that? So we've had to ask ourselves, we're all interested in sharks, we've got vested interest in it for various reasons, but why would you want to deliver a research agenda for conservation? What's the big deal? What's the issue? Here's what I would tell Nicola if I ever got the chance. Really, the wider public don't know about Scotland sharks. I've talked to people, they don't know we have sharks in Scotland. Do we have sharks? Some people tell me we have white sharks. The big scary toothy ones. That's not actually true, but we do have sharks, but the wider public don't either know about any sharks or they might know a few. But we also know even those people who are on the water constantly, they're not sure how many species we have in Scottish waters either, and they're the ones with the most hands-on experience. We know very little about the species that we do know we have in Scotland as well. So I know we're learning lots about seals and seabirds. We know a lot about where to find them, how many there are, and how to measure them. When we look across the species of sharks we have in Scotland, we actually don't even know how many of them. And this makes it pretty much impossible to conserve them. We don't know where they are, we don't know how they live, we don't know what they eat, how often they reproduce. That's a huge knowledge gap. So the sort of things we focus on in this big research group, SEORC, is the basic biology. What do we know about the sharks we've got, special areas and habitats? Where do they move to? Not all of them sit in the same spot in the mud. The roles in the ecosystem. Sharks can eat quite a bit and have a very important role in ecosystems, many of them as apex predators, very top of the food chain, some of them lower down. So without any of that knowledge, it's impossible to conserve them or even care about them. If you don't know how many species, what they do, how important they are, who really cares? The group we pulled together is really, as I've outlined, we're university scientists, we're government scientists, fishermen, anglers. A lot of the insights we have come from those people on the water, particularly the sea anglers, which have been instrumental in helping to back and kickstart a lot of the conservation efforts we do in Scotland for animals like common skate and spur dog. And I wanted to purposely show the two anglers up there just to say that these guys are on the water a lot. They're a really important source of information. It's not just geeky scientists in lab coats. We do need people out there with expert knowledge. Data from government and advisors and Scottish Natural Heritage is extremely valuable. And this will feed right back to government and to policy and eventually to law as well. So we need input from them. If we look through Scotland's National Marine Plan, this is something that came out a few years ago, it lists more than 30 species, actually, just in Scotland. And that fact is true. There are more than 30 species. But it makes it kind of think there's around 30 species. But there are more. So one of the very first things our group basically did is say, let's compile, let's look, how many species are we talking about in Scotland? 66. We actually have 66 species of sharks, skates, and rays in Scotland. And this is pretty much over like a 20-year period. So there's some really rare occurrences. We had a hammerhead shark about 20 years ago. Occasionally you get, the thresher sharks, the ones with the big tail fin that slaps around. We've got blue sharks occasionally, not often. And then some more common ones. So this also includes a list of sort of sporadic, weird visitors. We're not sure what they were doing up here, but 66 species in total. That was fantastic. This list is always growing as well. Okay, 66 species. Well, I can explain that a little bit better. There's Scotland, the landmass, but as a marine biologist, when I say Scotland, I actually refer to the exclusive economic zone, that red line around Scottish that shows you Scottish waters, the extent that Scotland's ocean goes out to. I think this is, yeah, I'm not sure if this one's the most up to date or not, but look at the area that actually includes that red line into the North Sea, up past Shetlands, all across the Rockall Trough, this deep basin on the left-hand side, and even further out to Rockall and Hatton Banks, and then further down south. That's a huge area. So it's maybe not surprising there's actually 66. Again, as a deep sea biologist, Scotland to me is a deep ocean. You have a lot of deep water areas here, and that's where actually a lot of those 66 species are coming from. They're coming from the deep ocean, and these data are coming to us through people like Marine Scotland Science, who are out doing fishery surveys, and the fishermen as well, coming back with some odd records. This is a weird and wonderful one that Marine Scotland came up with, I think, pretty recently. I think it was identified off the island, somewhere between Barra, anyway, when they were doing their fishery surveys. It's called a frilled cat shark. It's a massive shark. I don't think it's known to attack people, so no worries there. It's also called the sofa shark. Can you think of why it might be called a sofa shark? Would you like to sit on that? It looks pretty squishy to me. I think that's a sofa shark. It looks like you could sit on it, I guess. But weird and wonderful. We don't see them very often, especially in the fisheries trawl surveys, but they are out there. They are out there. And I just think they're fantastic. If you get a chance to Google frilled cat shark, you get some really crazy pictures off of Japan, in situ, in the ocean environment with its mouth open. The frills come from how its mouth is shaped and how it's looked. It doesn't have the kind of teeth that you associate with a shark. The Greenland shark, this is another lovely one. I'm sorry to say it eats seals, so I'm very sorry to follow that last talk. But it is a predator. It's a very boreal kind of Arctic species. It likes really, really cold waters. But a high-level predator as well. Again, we don't see them so often. They do get fairly deep, but it's one of these weird, wonderful, very large sharks that we get. And I hope this one's a bit more familiar too. It's not a white shark, it's a Porbeagle. And this is one of my favorite sharks in British waters and in Scotland as well. I think it's often confused for white sharks. Many misreports of white sharks actually turn out to be Porbeagle when you confirm them. I have a very small project on the side with the oil and gas industry, and what that's doing is talking to actually to platform workers and the guys out on the rigs who very often do observe Porbeagle swimming around the oil rigs. Question is, what are they doing there? Are they foraging off them? Are they just visiting them? Are they, aggregating to meet each other and do whatever sharks do when they get together? We don't know. Right now, it's just mapping out hotspots in the North Sea around oil rigs. What oil rigs are they visiting particularly? So you've got divers that go down on the rig to maintain the rig, and they have encounters, nothing violent, nothing dangerous. So the rig divers see them. The pilots who are operating these remotely operated vehicles, sort of like underwater drones, down the legs of the rig to inspect it for damage, and they'll see Porbeagle swimming across. The guys on the deck, on the jacket themselves, looking down, can see Porbeagle, and sometimes in great numbers. So it's really great to talk to them and get their stories, just to start understanding where they are and what they're doing there. Right, so we said 66 species. That's great. That's a lovely number, especially for the area of ocean we're looking at. But if we looked across the global average, Scotland has, within that 66 species, more threatened species. And by threatened, I mean, according to the IUCN, which is a conservation body that I guess, John, you're part of that basically ranks animals in terms of their conservation, their threatened status, starting with no, not to worry at all, right down to critically endangered and extinct. So on the global, according to the global average, Scotland has more of these threatened species, more species to worry about than on average. And this is where we're sitting. In Scotland, you can see least concern down to critically endangered. Data deficient, we have 5 species in Scotland out of that, or 5% of species we don't really have any data to even assess whether we should be really worried or not worried at all. That's kind of worrying. But the numbers I highlighted in yellow are just the really ones that we would call threatened. So if you combine that percentage, 11% vulnerable, and if you just compare to the right, the global, the ones to worry about. In Scotland, we've got more endangered species on average than global, and more critically endangered. These things could show local extinctions in Scotland if we're not careful. So it's just to be aware. That doesn't mean Scotland's doing a bad job at conserving species or a good job. It's just to be aware that we do have a kind of duty in Scotland to look after those sharks. They are already threatened. And many of Scotland's sharks are highly migratory, so maybe what we do in Scotland has a great benefit, but these sharks and skates and rays, mostly sharks, will swim off to other areas where there maybe isn't that protection. So anything we can do in Scotland to boost that, to give them that resilience, is a good thing. And that's really the Scotland having opportunities to give sharks the best chance they can possibly get. I'll talk about this one, this species in particular. This is taupe. And I'll talk a little bit about taupe in a minute. But again, like John was showing with the tags and the animal tracking that you can do, this is a really great technology to use with these animals. And within this SEORT project, we've done some field studies to tag and track a lot of these different sharks, including taupe. A few years ago, this is an electronic tag that's put on taupe. And it's inserted through, and very quickly the animal's released within about 4 minutes. And this records all sorts of data, temperature, depth, and it's time to pop off at a certain time. And preliminary data is really interesting in this one because these sorts of tags were popping off 2 months later off the Azores. So here we're fishing one day at about 20 meters depth off Luce Bay in southwest Scotland. 2 months later, these things are popping off the Azores. When you download the data that tag had stored in it, these animals were diving down to 800-900 meters depth, which is basically the limit of that tag, and it sort of wouldn't record anymore because that was the limit. We weren't expecting to see that depth, so we didn't order the right tag to handle that. But anyways, that was fascinating. So we got this tag back that way, one of them anyway. They're also showing, there's a strong evidence to suggest these animals, taupe, are coming back year after year, the same taupe coming back year after year to the same spot. And I think I'll talk a bit more about taupe next. Let's talk a bit more about this guy. So the species is invulnerable. This is considered one of the threatened IUCN categories. And I've just said some taupe move from Luce Bay to Portugal, usually to overwinter. There's strong evidence. There's mating scars on the bodies of these sharks, little scratches and stuff that when they mate, they leave these scars. They're coming up to Luce Bay to meet other mates and make baby pups that then they usually pop down south off Portugal and Spain. The recaptures the anglers are reporting, they can get the same shark in the same spot 10 years on. So it may not be staying there the whole time, but it's coming back to the same spot. Whatever it's gone and done in the world, it's come back to that spot. Another species you might have heard of is the common skate. It's actually, we think, maybe genetically a complex of other species that's being worked out at the moment. Tags are showing this one has extremely high residency. These guys don't really move, so if a fishing trawl were to come by, these population numbers have declined dramatically across the region they're used to occur in. There's evidence as well that they stay in the same groups. These aren't solitary animals. They group together and they tend to stay with their brothers and sisters, or at least siblings or relations, over a very long period of time. And I'm happy to say that the species does now benefit from protection. There is now in place a marine protected area, a very large area actually covering this. It's from Loch Sonart to Sound of Jura. So that's a nice story. It's still critically endangered, but we could see in time that with these sort of conservation measures and management measures in place, we're hoping the next round may show an improvement and we maybe go back down to endangered. A spur dog is also called spiny dogfish. Where I'm from in Canada, I didn't know it was called spur dog. We call it spiny dogfish. And over here, we call it spur dog. It's also critically endangered in the Northeast Atlantic. And this is a really nice animal to work with. These guys have pups in their bellies for two years. So they're pregnant for 2 years. That's a long time. And what the tagging is showing these guys also, in particular Loch Etive, which is a sea loch on the west coast of Scotland near Oban, they have a high fidelity. They're very loyal to that area. Some of those sharks don't move out of the loch. Some of them go out but come back again. That's the fidelity story. The residency means they're resident. Lots of them just stay where they're put. And when you go to Loch Etive, you might understand it's a beautiful spot. Some of the tagging work we've also done, a mark recapture, when you put a tag in and then you recapture it later, is showing that a lot of these animals stay there. They're born there and they stay there. It's a shark nursery. We get a lot of juvenile and even we call neonatal sharks. They're just born, we call them shark pups. They're very sweet little things. And the loch is filled with them. So this is just showing you some of the stuff we've done on spur dog. Recently there was an acoustic array put out. This is basically 10 stations of that acoustic receiver, 10 stations up this sea lock at different spots. It's listening for these transmitters, these internal tags that we would put inside the body of the shark. When the shark swims near the acoustic station, it pings, the station records that, and we can get that data to say which shark it was, how long they were there, were they at this depth, what were they doing. And we also tagged, just these don't record anything, these spaghetti tags, they're shaped like spaghetti. They're just inserted in the back near the dorsal fin, and they have a special unique number, and when someone recaptures it, they call us and say, I've recaught your shark. Last year in November, I was out in Loch Etive. We used I love robotic toys and technology. We went out with this autonomous underwater vehicle, and all we did was we range tested each of those 10 stations, basically saying, if this shark was within 50 meters, would we be able to detect it? If it were within 500 meters of the station, would we be able to detect it? Just to give us some uncertainty bounds. Here's Loch Etive. We used to live in Loch Etive. We had a house overlooking it. It's a beautiful spot. This is typical West Coast weather, isn't it? It's sunny, it's flat, calm. So that, yeah, clearly typical. So this is out here last November, finishing up the mark recapture study and also range testing those stations. This blue tag on the upper right-hand side, that's one of those little dart tags. It has a unique number for the shark. That's a baby shark. So you can see that's someone's gloved hand. That shark's sitting there like a little toy. It's the size of a toy, essentially. It doesn't show up well, I'm afraid, but there is a scar here from where it was attached to its mother. It's its belly button. I don't know why I'm pointing to my belly button, because you know where yours is, but that's the shark's belly button right there. That will disappear in a while, but it's a neonate. It's just been born. That scar is still there. And here's us doing some basic sort of measurements like you do with the seals. You make sure every time you get a shark out of the water, you handle it very quickly, you minimize stress, take the critical measurements, the length, the girth, the sex, anything interesting else about it. So neonatal and juvenile fish are still being recaught years later. These babies are in that loch for now, we've got one nearly about 3 years now. It's growing, and every time we recatch it, we can see how much it's grown. And that's really important information we didn't have before. So it's the first study of its kind ever. Scotland the deep. I'm getting to the end, I think. Coming back to the deep, the story was basically, I am a deep sea biologist primarily. And a couple of years ago, a few years now actually, time flies, we had a research cruise that went across from west coast of Scotland and Glasgow out to the Seamounts, up to Rockall Bank and further up north. We did a lot of collecting and surveying with robotic vehicles, these remote underwater drone-like vehicles, ROVs we call them. And we were collecting things all the time. So there were 2 spots I want to focus on. The Mingulay Reef Complex off the island of Barra. It's only about 100 to 200 meters deep. It's not proper deep sea. And the Hebrides Terrace Seamount, which we'll go into a bit later, is quite deep. It's about 2 kilometers down. So I'm going to focus on 2 of these areas. Just to give you a bit more detail. And that brings me to my props. I forgot, I brought props. So let's start off with something here. First of all, back to the west coast off Barra. Do you see that arrow up there? It's pointing to an egg case of a deep sea shark. These sharks, this one you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, are actually laying their eggs. Some sharks lay eggs, just to remind you. Some sharks, skates and rays, lay eggs. So this is really cool. This is a deep sea cat shark, and the way I remember that is that egg case is actually shaped a bit like a cat, I think. So what this shark is actually doing is laying its eggs on this deep sea coral. And we have coral in Scotland. We have deep sea reefs. And that's a piece of deep sea coral, Lephelia pertusa. It's actually quite widely distributed across the planet. It weighs a lot. It feels a lot like bone when you feel it, like a skeleton. This thing's forming reefs off the island of Barra at about 100, 200 meters depth. It's now a marine protected area. That's what that boundary is around there. It was discovered in 2003, this reef. Extensively mapped. It's sort of our play spot. We go out and we do loads of sampling. We've learned a lot about deep ocean and deep sea corals in particular, in that one particular spot. When you open up the egg, it has this little shark embryo in it. So we were able to, from the egg case and the embryo, identify that it belonged to this particular species of deep sea shark, a blackmouth cat shark. And what we then did is we went back to some of the earlier samples we'd done over nearly a decade ago, and found out, actually these egg cases were in all of our samples we were taking. We went back and we realized every time they were laying eggs, it was within the same kind of area. Now this reef complex is 4 kilometers across, but but we were only finding the eggs in one spot the same year. So the shark population, maybe the same mother shark, I don't know, is going back to the same coral area and laying eggs, which we thought was pretty cool. It's a species of least concern. There's loads of them still out there. There's no reason to think they're, being threatened at the moment. There's the Hebrides terrace seamount, and this is now happily part of a marine protected area. We went out and we did some ROV dives. That's the ROV we use. This is a massive underwater robot that has cameras, has robotic arms on it. There's no one sitting in it. It's winched over the side of the ship, and people sit comfortably in a little lab, and they look at a video screen, and they get to remotely operate this thing. And we did this transect on this eastern flank of the seamount, and we started spotting these egg cases. And we basically went along our video, and we reanalyzed it, counting the egg cases. I was talking about the size of the seamount. We found the egg cases 1,500 meters deep. That's a kilometer and a half down. And it's 2,000 meters and beyond to the actual bottom. That makes this seamount, this underwater volcano, bigger than Ben Nevis. So if you can picture Ben Nevis covered in water, that's what the Hebrides terrace seamount is, but even bigger. And we managed to get at least 3 of these little transects in to first explore. No one had ever explored it before, and that's one of the best things about being a deep sea biologist, is you see new stuff no one's ever seen. And this is just finishing off that deep sea skate story. We found out what species it was. There's a close-up a picture that the ROV took for us of the egg case on the seafloor. We opened it up, took a little sliver of the hard egg case, and inside is that embryo. And this is the yolk that it's still feeding on. And that's how it develops. It's a relatively young specimen. It wasn't ready to hatch yet, but when they're ready, they pop them, they wriggle enough, they break the egg case open, and you'll have seen stuff like this washed up on the beach, mermaid purses and things like that. So it's nothing unusual, but we'd never seen the seamount before. Again, luckily, it is a species of least concern, and that's because these egg cases and these fish are usually so deep, the fishermen can't get to them. They can't fish that deep. There just really isn't any gear that can get that deep. But we did some studies and found out we had also taken oceanographic measurements on that seamount, and where those egg cases were was a very specific sort of ocean habitat. It was a certain temperature, a certain ratio of salinity, we call it, saltiness. It was in a very specific sort of almost microhabitat. And with climate change happening in that deep basin where these egg cases are found, it could be in the next 10, 20 years that those conditions just won't be able to be there anymore. So if these egg cases are only growing in a certain ocean environment, climate change could actually affect the way they develop, or if they end up developing at all. So right now it's least concern, and that's a nice thing, but we do need to keep our eyes on it, get back out there and get some better ideas of numbers. As I said, if you picture Ben Nevis, picture yourself walking up maybe, a kilometer up the way, and do that 3 times. Just one straight line up Ben Nevis, another straight line, another straight line. Would you have seen all of Ben Nevis? There's no way. And this is the problem with the seamount. We've done these 3 new exploratory surveys. We need to do more. So that's just to conclude the deep sea bit, my rant in deep sea. If I'd have to take questions, thank you very much for listening.